Thanks, Mark, and hello, everybody. And I absolutely cannot answer those questions in 15 minutes for obvious reasons. But what I'll try to do is frame some of the problems and how we as a global trade union have been addressing them. I should say that IndustriALL is a fairly new global union. We were a result of a merger in 2012, bringing together the Textile, Garment, Leather and Footwear Global Union with the Energy and Mining Global Union and the International Metalworkers Federation. So what I'm going to really focus on is the garment industry. As you heard from the consumers, this is an industry that people relate very closely to, and it's the industry where most of the innovative supply chain work has been happening. But I was asked to frame this presentation in the context of trust, because that's the theme of this conference. And I think it's fair to say that there's very little trust in the way that global supply chains operate at the moment. There's very little trust that the multinational corporations that benefit are able to guarantee workers' rights. There's very little trust that the corporate social responsibility programs that they've had do anything. There's very little trust that unions have the right to organize. They don't. And there's very little trust that the governments in the countries that are producing in these global supply chains are able to protect the workers. Basically, is a lack of trusted institutions that can play their role. And this is very apparent in the garment industry. I'll just paint you a picture of why that is. This is a list of only Bangladesh garment factory deaths in the period from 2005 to 2013. And you'll recognize that 2013, of course, was the year that Rana Plaza collapsed and put a lot of global attention on these conditions. But this has been going on for years, primarily as a result of fires and building collapses. There have been massive numbers of deaths in the garment industry, and this has been an ongoing history. Death, of course, is the worst thing that can happen to a worker, but there's many other poor conditions, as Mark referred to, very low wages, very long working hours, very precarious employment. But what Rana Plaza did was it helped to focus the attention of the world on the issues, and I'll show in a moment how it made it possible for us to start to do some more useful things about this situation. But just while I'm on the topic of trust, just to illustrate why there was a lack of trust in any institutions to deal with these problems. This is a list of cases in red, which some of them were mentioned on the previous slide. People died, and in each of these cases, corporate social responsibility auditing had taken place and evidently failed to protect any of those workers. And this is not, of course, including all of the injured workers from those incidents. So, I mean, this is a very stark picture which helps to understand exactly why there is so little trust in CSR. So what Rana Plaza managed to enable us to do was to sign the Bangladesh Accord, which is unprecedented. There's never been anything like it, and there still is nothing like it. Over 220 global garment brands have signed the accord. This is not a multi-stakeholder initiative. This is not CSR. This is a legally binding agreement between the parties to industrial relations, between trade unions and companies, but applied to the supply chain. It includes incentives for suppliers to comply with the safety provisions, and it provides sanctions if they don't. And we, as trade unions, can enforce the accord against the brands that have made the commitments under it. So having all of these elements I'm telling you are there because they have to be there. And what we've seen, and I can say it a little more confidently now after nearly 4 years of the accord, is that there haven't been any deaths in accord inspected and remediated factories. We haven't completed remediation. There's still a lot to be done, but there haven't been the history of deaths that we've seen on the previous slide. So it's working, but it is one element of worker protection in one industry, in one country, and it requires an awful lot of resources. But in terms of precedent value of how you address issues in global supply chains, this is the way forward, we believe, because it is a proper agreement between the parties to industrial relations, which is legally binding and applies across the supply chain. The other important theme that I'll come back to is that this raises conditions across an industry. And one of the problems, another chord slide, hang on, before I come to that. One of the problems that we face in the garment industry is it's very difficult for an individual company, even if a big one like H&M, to affect real change in the supply chains. We have some global framework agreements directly with individual companies, and a very strong one is the one that we have with H&M, which enables us to work with them to ensure that the factories that supply to H&M are functioning properly and there's access for the trade unions and all sorts of good things. But the individual company approach is never going to be enough to lift up standards in the garment industry. And that's why, and we can perhaps come back to this in the questions, the initial video about consumers wanting to know where can I buy my clothes, where is good, where is bad, doesn't really apply, because you've got factories that are supplying to multiple brands. And as soon as one brand starts to try and improve conditions, what do? They just do it for the production line that's producing for them, and what happens when they're no longer taking orders from that factory, and what happens when that factory takes its business elsewhere because there's another buyer who will pay more or who will expect less of them. It's just not possible to do that. So what we've learned is that to be effective, we have to treat the systemic issues at an industry-wide basis. When you're talking about low wages, you're talking about long working hours, you're talking about precarious employment. These are systemic in the industry, and it won't work to do it factory by factory. And that has shown with the Accord by bringing all of the brands together, by working collectively across the whole factory base. We're lifting standards and taking all of these issues out of competition, so they can't be undercut by other factories offering cheaper to the buyers, and they can't be undercut by buyers who don't care at all, and there are many of those coming in and undercutting those efforts. So that's what we've learned. So we're applying this approach to some of the other areas, and one of the most burning issues is, of course, low wages, and that's what I wanted to show you just as an illustration. In this slide, there are many, many calculations that have been done like this, but it basically shows, and this is a nice coloured one, the problem about workers' wages. The wage part of that T-shirt is the yellow bit right at the top. That's the percentage of a T-shirt of its retail cost that goes to the actual worker that made it. And you can imagine making a T-shirt. The labour part is not insignificant. You've got the cotton. But it's really the labour that's putting the T-shirt together, and you can multiply that by into more complex garments that require more labour input. So I won't dwell on that, but just to show you, this is an illustration of why it's a problem. So the problem with wages in the garment industry is there's no real institutions and structures to work on wages. The garment workers in many production countries, unlike a lot of workers, rely for their actual wages on the minimum wage in their country. So in order to lift garment worker wages, you have to actually lift the minimum wage, which is a heavy lift, and doesn't work. As you can see from this slide, and these are some of the wage protests of recent years around raising minimum wages. I mean, these are all our affiliates, and they have mobilised, and we have made progress. But like I say, it's a heavy lift, and there's problems with it. It delivers results that are too low. They're highly contested, and that also includes by the government, because it's the government that sets minimum wages, and they're not necessarily minimum wages that are specific to the garment industry. They would also apply across other sectors, so the government has to take that into account. And they're also very mindful of their country's competitive position in the global garment market. So a particular country, take Bangladesh, which currently has the lowest, doesn't want to increase its wages for risk of being seen as less competitive relative to other countries that are also competing for business. So it's very, very problematic. The other thing, of course, is it doesn't address other wage-related factors. And when you think about collective bargaining on wages, you're not only bargaining for the wage, you're bargaining for the whole package of conditions, which impact also on the amount that you're prepared to negotiate for. You're negotiating on what hours you work, what other benefits there are, what's the sick leave like, what's the maternity leave like, what's the productivity, and how does that get passed on to the workers? Many, many issues which minimum wage mechanisms are unable to address. But critically, in global supply chain environments, there's no role for the brands. And this comes back to the question about what the people on the street were saying. If I pay more, well, as I understood from Mark's interpretation, I'm not pretending to have understood the original, if I pay more for my clothes, is that going to help the workers? Is that going to be passed on? Well, obviously the answer is no, because there's no linkage between minimum wage fixing here and brand retail price here. And as I said before, if you work at the level of an individual brand like H&M, if H&M raised its prices, would that translate into increased worker wages? And H&M have tried to do this. They have programs to try to do this, and it's just not possible. So it's pointless us making that demand on brands because we know they can't deliver it. What is lacking is a mechanism. So this is what we've been working on as a global union. We need a system that lifts standards across the industry. As I said before, you can't raise wages in some factories and not others because that just undermines the whole situation and keeps wages as a matter of competition, which they shouldn't be. We need a mechanism that enables workers themselves to be able to enforce the payment of the wage, that addresses all of these other issues that impact on skills and efficiency, and that recognises the impact of the brand's purchasing practices to ensure that that is factored in. So with that in mind, we have signed an agreement with these brands to start with. We expect that more will join. We've been working on this for about 3 years now. And the process is called ACT, Action, Collaboration and Transformation. And what it is trying to deal with are these missing structures that will give a mechanism for these good things to happen. And essentially what ACT is this. At its heart, it is developing a system of industry-wide collective agreements in garment-producing countries which are linked to the purchasing practices of the brands. And they need to be linked in two ways. Ultimately, they need to be linked in the sense that when there is a collective agreement in place, the brands will ensure that the conditions of that agreement are met by their suppliers. But even before you get to the point of having a collective agreement, we need the brands to ensure that their suppliers have the confidence to negotiate. In none of the major garment-producing countries is there industry-wide collective bargaining, which would enable these things to be done. So we are working with these brands to set up such a mechanism, and for the brands to make this work. I mean, there's many things that have to be done. You have to create a legislative framework for it. You have to persuade people that it's a good thing and it's in their benefit. But ultimately, it's about getting more value from the supply chain down to the national level, so that you can't. The workers and the employers are both scrambling for the same small piece of the pie that they're granted through the pricing policies of the multinational companies. We need to make that pie bigger, and we also have to deal with the distribution of that pie at national level. So there's many factors there, but we need the brands to make commitments that will enable the suppliers to enter into such agreements. When we talk to factories about raising the minimum wage, and I've dealt already with the government's responses, the factories say, well, we can't possibly pay any more because we're not getting any more from the brands. They're squeezing us with their pricing. So we need to ring-fence wages in a way that ensures that the price that is paid makes it possible for the terms of the agreement to be met. But you can't do that without having the agreement in place, and that is what is entirely lacking. So we're trying to deal with this at a systemic level. understanding how the industry actually functions, and to find a way that will create a level playing field for wages, but also for the manufacturers, so that they can be sure that the buyers that they're working with will be paying a price and setting conditions, because it's not only about the price, it's about all sorts of, timing of orders, etc., that will enable them to reach an agreement and to abide by those terms. So, circling back to trust, just to finish off, trust isn't something that really comes into this. We don't believe in trust, we believe in actual binding agreements that you can enforce. For the brands, it's more of an issue. They like to know that they can trust us, and it's because of the trust that we've developed through working through the Accord that we've managed to get them to voluntarily enter into this agreement, because of course people enter voluntarily into agreements, but then you have to make it enforceable to keep them there. So trust gets you to the table, I guess, but at the end of the day you can't rely on trust, you need to have something that's binding. So wish us luck, because it's a big job, but we think that this is the best hope that we have of moving the bar. Thank you.